So it's my pleasure to be speaking here today at this seminar, which I have been attending for the past 2 years. So I have to say I'm a PhD candidate here at Sorbonne University. I don't work on heritage, but I work in contemporary art in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, and I do a kind of comparative analysis of the three. But what I'll be presenting today is the intersection of contemporary art and heritage, precisely at this specific type, which is called ITIS, which usually presents like this. So it's basically a contest of two poets, improvisers. This can be like a man and a woman, two women, two men, who are usually sitting in front of each other. And they are improvising with the help of musical instruments. So I will be mostly speaking about the context of today's Kazakhstan. So in Kazakhstan, they're mostly using this instrument called dombra, which is like a string instrument. And basically the idea is that there is a competition and wins the one who has more of a musical skills in poetry, in improvising, also in wit, because these have to be like very original, beautiful words that they should be using. Yeah, and so usually, two people sitting in national clothes and kind of doing this musical competition. So there is a spoken word and poetry and music. So the talk, how do I pass to the next page? Yeah, now I see. Okay. I'll have like 3 parts in my presentation today. So I'll try to address ITIS from the perspective of history, its development in the pre-Soviet and like colonial period, then Soviet period, and then independence. I also try to theorize it as intangible cultural heritage. And then I'll pass to contemporary artists, and we'll see 2 cases where contemporary artists use this type of heritage and why basically they do it. How can I move this panel? Sorry. Okay, now I see. So basically my guiding questions for today are: what potential do contemporary artists see in ITIS? And what makes this cultural heritage relevant for the artistic production in the current political and social context of present-day Kazakhstan? So I have to start by saying that there is not a lot of sources that exist on ITIS. It's actually a very understudied type of art. And we have hard time kind of identifying when ITIS originated as art practice. What is known for sure is that it was already here during the 18th century, and some researchers agree that the 19th century was actually the golden age of ITIS. For my today's presentation, I mostly relied on this paper by Asil Mukasheva, which is like a Kazakhstani fellow colleague. It was published in a collective volume called Kazakhstan Labyrinth современного постколониального дискурса, so Labyrinth of Contemporary Post-Colonial Discourse. It was a volume edited by Alima Bisenova, and it was published in 2023 by Tselimny, which is a contemporary art center in Kazakhstan. So this is like, I think, the fullest source that you have on ITIS, where Asil tries to trace the history of this type of art, and then maybe to examine it through perspective of post-colonial theory. What is important to say is that Akın's poets that are participating in ITIS are called Akın or ITISker. And ITIS is at the same time the form and also the event itself, the competition itself. So people would say, I will go and see ITIS. I saw ITIS yesterday. We're doing ITIS today. So basically, it's like basic terminology. Some other essential elements include the fact that it's only improvisation-based performance. So there is a music in poetry, musical accompaniment, poetry. It's kind of a dialogue and duel in the sense that 2 people perform in front of each other, and everyone has time when they basically develop their argument. And the opponent would sit there and listen and would give time for the first performer to finish their argument, and then they would reply. So it's like throwing bows to each other, each time replying with words and music. So the topic on which people improvise is defined by the audience. So nothing is known in advance. People come usually to some concert halls today, and there is an audience which says, okay, this should be the topic of today's competition, and then they develop it. Another key element of ITIS is that it has to be openly critical. So it has to address anything. There is like basically no subject which is taboo, which means that you can actually criticize the political regime, you can criticize the ruler, you can also criticize the opponent in the way they look. There are some like physical specificities or something like this. And so when it comes to this criticism and openly speaking, there are two distinct notions. So there's like şındık aytu, which means saying truth, basic truth. And there is this dat aytu, and that is like the political truth. So it would be a political claim, basically, to a ruler. And usually, like in the pre-colonial step, let's say, Aytăscher would be very much respected for their possibility to address the criticism, and they would be like seen as mediators of people because they would always voice some different problems and issues that are happening in a society. And then in today's Aytăs, there is usually a jury. At the end of the competition, the jury would identify who wins. And the winning poet, as I was saying, combines musicality, rhythm, originality with wisdom, and usually that the very interesting sayings or words, improvising words, poetry becomes actually popular sayings among people. So basically, I was saying previously that 19th century, was the golden age of Aytăs, and there are some documentations that left of one precisely historical Aytăs that took place in 1871 between two poets, Brjan and Sara. It's kind of a love story, but also based on Aytăs, on a competition of these two young people. And later in the Soviet time, so Kazakh Soviet composer Mukan Tulubayev, he would write an opera which would be based on this historical Aytăs. And so the opera would be staged in Almaty, which was the capital of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, in 1946. In 1948, it would travel to Moscow, and it's still today performed by the Astana Opera. Astana is the modern capital of independent Kazakhstan. Of course, when speaking of the history of Aytăs, I should say that because this type of art is like very much rooted in a particular territory, in its culture, it would only be held in Kazakh language, so like local languages would be used. And during Soviet power, during Soviet regime, Aytăs would take place, but they would be different, let's say. So this component of speaking openly and criticizing a regime would, of course, be stripped off. In that sense, maybe Zhambul Jabayev's figure represents like a prominent example of such, kind of instrumentalization of Aytăs, because he was celebrated as a popular akın poet. There is like a monument to him in basically every Kazakhstani city, and even I know that in Ukraine, in Kiev, they also have Zhambul's monument. He would be like really famous and celebrated as Aytăscher, but at the same time, that would be someone who would never criticize Soviet power, right? That there is this poem that he wrote, which is called Leningradцы дети мои, Leningraders, children of mine, which was about the blockade of Leningrad during the World War II. And there would be some other, very ideologically charged topics that he would raise, like освоение целины, the campaign of the Virgin Land, or I don't know, celebrating Communist Party in his poems. So people are there is like, I would say, very ambiguous perception of his heritage today in today's Kazakhstan. But still, Aytăs would take place up until 1940s. And I would say then, from 1940s onwards, there was like a less of Aytăs being present in the public sphere. Maybe one video, if it plays, I hope you can see it. Do you have sound? Because we don't.
No, unfortunately, no.
Okay, so it's a very interesting video, but at least let's look at the pictures. Basically, it's about Aytăs and how during Soviet times it was held, and there's like at the same time, a Communist Party meeting, and people are raising very important questions like how good Soviet women live, how, I don't know, any specific, this was about one specific region in Kazakhstan, Zhezkazgan in central Kazakhstan. So they would celebrate the specificity of this region. It's mining industry. So it's like very in the like Soviet propaganda way, right? But it's interesting how it was still adopted, because you would still see like people dressed in national clothes and singing to national instruments, right?
Speaking Russian or
Speaking in Kazakh.
yes.
But it would be translated to everyone. So yeah, things change quite drastically during Perestroika, because it's the moment when television arrives. And actually it was very important for formation of ITIS as it is known today, because the ITIS we know nowadays is the televised ITIS. So it's always broadcasted on TV. Now you can even find it on YouTube and on TikTok, Instagram. But previously it was like very much, they would gather a lot of people, a lot of elders throughout the country. And so during Perestroika, it all starts. But 1986 is an important date, which changes things, because there is a massive student uprising in Almaty, which was the capital. It's called Jeltoktan today, which means December, because the events took place on 16th, 17th of December. Well, basically, the idea was that young students, they went to the protest because they were not agreeing with the decision of dismissing Honayev, which was the Secretary General of Communist Party of Kazakhstan at the moment. And another person, Gennady Kolbin, was assigned as the new Secretary General. And this was someone who was never previously familiar with Kazakhstan. He's never been to Kazakhstan. So young people were really against that. So they went to the square, and the movement was obviously very much oppressed. There was a lot of victims, and then they were all portrayed as, nationalists. And so, of course, when this happened, ITIS they wanted to react to that. They wanted to make ITIS about that. And of course, they couldn't, because previously they would be having their concerts in this beautiful building, which is now the Republic Palace, Dvorets Respubliki. Previously, it was the Dvorets Lenina, so Lenin Palace in Almaty, today Almaty. So previously they were having access to this kind of infrastructure, but after 1986, of course, they couldn't. Also, the Communist Party in advance, they asked for, retranscription of text that would be sang, but it was not possible because it's an art based on improvisation, so she cannot prepare the text in advance, right? So there was like this idea of controlling. And then we, of course, arrived to the independence. And now basically this happens like this. So you see like huge halls, people, cameras, and then like rounds of 2 performers, and then they sing. And yeah, this is how it is known today. So Aysel Mukasheva, in this paper of hers, she identifies 6 topics, main ones. She says that basically she like made a reading of many ITIS, and these are the most recurrent topics that she has seen. So it's about the idea of land and like the colonization, Sovietization, yeah. Kazakh language, because it's pretty much rooted in local language. Then Jeltoktan, this December uprising, the 1991 independence, the idea of collective memory and addressing some collective history and events from that history, and then ecology. Ecology, I think, is an interesting one. And quoting one poet from the Kızıldağ region. Kızıldağ is a region situated next to Aral Sea. She puts this example. So I prepared you like the text in Russian and then the translation in English. So I will read the translation in English. In my Simei, there are mountains and cliffs. Its map seems unchanged at first glance. But after 40 years of serving as a testing ground, 40 wounds were left upon its body. So basically, here she's referencing Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, right? There is the Aral, tormented by thirst, turned into a cautionary tale on every tongue. Each time a ship ascends from Baikonur, everything around ignites and is laid to waste. This is where we have arrived in 70 years, meaning 70 years of Soviet power. And there are still so many secrets left unspoken. Though the empire has fallen, even in death, it swings an axe at our future. Like a lion deceived by a cunning fox, it is high shattered by a fall from great height. So basically, you see that the range of thematic issues that are being raised in ITIS is quite large, right? Today, ITIS is still very popular. As I was saying, it's still organized, and there's like a lot of TV concerts. There is actually the major state TV channel called Kazakhstan, which owns all of the exclusive rights on broadcasting, specifically all of the big ITIS throughout the country. Akans, the poets who are participating in ITIS, they're like really respected celebrities. They have a lot of like economic and social capital. They can become quite quickly opinion leaders. And there were some attempts to institutionalize this type of art after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For some reason, they still called this institution Union of Akans. So it's like a union of poets. It exists since 2012. And then there are some centers that are built for young poets who want to learn this type of art. And maybe one example of how important ITIS can be, this would be about this guy who's like a huge celebrity in Kazakhstan, Rinat Zaitov, who's originally a performer of ITIS. But then in 2019, he launched a YouTube project, which was called ITIS Online. So basically the idea was that he would teach young ITISkers, young poets online, and they would do sessions of ITIS via Skype. And then he created a specific YouTube channel. And then in 2019, also Nursultan Nazarbayev dismissed. So he resigned, sorry. And there were like new elections, presidential elections that were announced. And so all of the people that were part of this union of poets, they supported official candidate, which is now who is today president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. But Rinat Zaitov was the only one who actually supported the opposition candidate. And he was openly saying on his channel that he's not okay with, he thinks it's a propaganda. And then, of course, the official candidate won the election. And Rinat Zaitov was like, okay, I don't agree with the decision. Let's all go out and let's meet in the city center and let's protest. And basically, so many people went out. There were thousands of people in the center of Almaty who came to his call. And of course, police had to intervene. There was like a huge march during throughout one of the largest streets of Almaty. And quite quickly, he got detained. And then, of course, I think they kind of explained to him that, yeah, either you continue in this way and you'll be in jail, or you accept kind of the rules of the game. And today, he's part of the official party of the president of Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, which is called Amanat. And this is why on the second picture, you can see him like in his cabinet with the flag of Kazakhstan, who's now chinovnik, right? Yeah. So now let's switch to ITIS's cultural heritage. So it was inscribed in 2015 by UNESCO in the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. In the category of oral traditions and expressions and performing arts, what is interesting is that this list mentions only 2 nation states, as you know, cultures that bear ITIS, which are Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. But actually in practice, there are much more people who practice this type of art. So I know that in Bashkortostan, they have ITIS. In Turkmenistan, they have some type of it. In Karakalpakstan, in Turkey, they have it in Azerbaijan. And there is this organization called Turksoy, which kind of brings together all of the Turkic nations. And they would usually organize this ITIS performances that would be held somewhere in Istanbul, for example. The last one that they organized was in 2021. So basically, you see, it's very interesting how this idea of nation state and this heritage kind of intersects, because, yeah, there are some limits, basically. So yeah, here I just wanted to say that I was also basing my argumentation on this amazing publication that was mentioned by Irina Sandomirskaya during her intervention. And I also thank Svetlana Gashanina for sharing the file of the publication with me. So basically, this in this publication, Chiara Bortolotto, she kind of argues that today we live in this, what she calls sustainable development turn. And basically, when we speak about intangible heritage today, we don't reference things of the past, like past relics, fragile relics of the past that we need to save. But basically, we're looking for actively reproduce social practices, rituals that are about to save us, because we live in the moment of polycrisis. There's so many things going on, like ecologically speaking, politically speaking, military conflicts, and basically humanity itself is now in the situation where we need to be saved. And so Chiara Bortolotto kind of says that intangible heritage, it might be one of the elements which could still like help us to survive and maybe make this earth livable for future generations, right? So she kind of thinks of intangible cultural heritage as the one which is constantly recreated, as the one which is a set of elements that communities and groups can reinvent in response to their environment, their interaction with nature and their history. It also is a heritage which provides a sense of identity to a group, to a source community, a continuity within a certain history that might have been fragmented due to colonization or some other events. And of course, it becomes a resource for imagining sustainable solutions for the future. So one quote from this publication, for tangible cultural heritage, peoples have long disappeared, the loss has already happened, and thus heritage protection is intended as a conservation of their remains. Losing intangible cultural heritage instead means losing the very possibility of its reenactment and therefore of the continuous existence of particular aspects of contemporary yet often marginalized civilizations. In other words, the loss not only is behind us, but also lies ahead. It is yet to come. So I think this framework is very relevant when we think about this, and especially when we see how this is being used in the works of contemporary artists. I have to admit that it's only recently that contemporary artists started working with this and kind of moved their attention towards this type of art. And it actually happened post-2022. So I claim that this turn is certainly to be approached from a decolonial perspective. Why 2022 is an important date? Because, well, first of all, there is like a biggest popular uprising happening in January 2022 in Kazakhstan, which is called like Bloody January, Khandı-Khantar, where basically the current president solidifies the power. It's like still we don't know what happened. There were like officially more than 200 people killed. We don't know the real numbers. We don't know. We have some, elements of truth. There was like a elite clash and many things going on. But what we know is that nowadays the population of Kazakhstan has like very low trust in the regime. So basically there was like this clash of discommunication, basically, and discontent with the political situation. And then, of course, 2022 is important because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 24th February 2022, which is like felt very strongly in Kazakhstan, the country which has the largest border with Russia. And because there was like a lot of migration from Russia to Kazakhstan after the invasion. Even in the artistic field, there are many artists who now live in Kazakhstan. They try to like reconstruct their lives artistically in many other ways. So these two moments, they kind of triggered this turn to like decoloniality, to one's own roots, to one's own identity, to one's own history. And that's why I think this is now appearing in the works of contemporary artists. So I'll be presenting two examples of these two artists who present, I think, two different generations. You have Medina Bazargali, who's very young. She was born in 2001 in the already independent Kazakhstan. And her art is really about like new technologies, new media. She does a lot of coding, all this like VR, augmented reality installations. And then on the other side, you have Sılıkbek Bekbota, which is like an artist of the 80s. So he was born in 87. He still has this experience of living under like Soviet Union. Another maybe important distinction between these two perspectives is that Medina comes from a city while Sılıkbek comes from a village. So he has this like villager's perspective on contemporary art. Also, Medina may be mostly from a Russian-speaking environment, and Sılıkbek would be mostly from a Kazakh-speaking environment. So these elements are important, but they still show that both of these groups kind of finding attraction in this for some reason. So let's look at Medina's work, which is actually a 2-channel video installation called Aytız. It was done in 2023, and it's very simple, plastically super simple, because you have two videos that are shown on two screens next to each other, and you see an actual ITIS going on. So to create this piece, Medina has collaborated with students of Jurgenov Art Academy. So basically, you don't actually teach ITIS in the academy, but there are some courses during which this type of art is mentioned. And so she came to the teacher of this academy, to the students, and said, like, I have this idea. I want to stage actually a real ITIS, and I will just film in a very dry documentary manner. I will film you, and you will just do your ITIS. And basically, what we see as a result is just this classical ITIS between a young man and young woman, where they mention a range of subjects going from like collective history to maybe some feminist approaches, because obviously we understand the video lasts for like almost 22 minutes, and during it we understand that they are actually relatives. So the woman is the sister-in-law of that man, and there's like a lot of internal jokes, internal criticizing. For example, she says, Instagram is my work, dear, but your song is useless and empty, and things like this. And then they would also mention like the colonialism and the breakthrough, and maybe the distance from the USSR. So there would be a range of different subjects that they would discuss during this ITIS. But eventually, it's a very classical ITIS. And Medina, when describing this work, she says that she didn't want to be an artist. She just wanted to film them and rather be like so she would not really guide them. She would not say, you should be speaking about this subject or that subject. She would only like put her camera. And then the second example, which is the solo show of Serdar Begbota. I saw it last summer in Almaty, in the newly opened Italian Cultural Center in Almaty. And it was a multimedia installation where he basically recreated a classical apartment that you can find today in any city. But the apartment was built with the help of very precarious architecture, and there was like this transparent film prints, and on different screens you would see like this. So basically different elements of apartment. It's a very kitsch, on purpose, very kitschy design. So he would choose, I think, the cheapest materials. But you see, like everywhere there would be screens, and on every screen there would be actors. And what he says basically that this installation kind of reflects his own experience of migration from a village to a city, where living in the village and listening to ITIS, he would feel that, you know, when you live in the steppe and you go to the steppe in the night, basically you feel like you're the only one on this planet. There's no one around you. But when you live in an apartment, the experience is completely different, because you always hear what your neighbors are doing, what they're talking about, and you always feel that you are being kind of even under surveillance, right? So that's why he wanted to have like this very transparent film, and so that people could be seen when inside, people could see each other. People could also hear ITIS, because in every room there would be another screen, and so this would create like a sonic pollution. So very like tensed environment, and it's kind of a reflection on the conditions in which today ITIS is being listened to, in which is being seen, and also maybe the apartments that some ITISers, as very celebrated ones, can get as a reward from government. If, for example, they're not very critical towards them, they can be actually rewarded, and they could be given such apartments. And maybe one of the quotes of Salabek, he said, "For me, ITIS is not just folklore, but a contemporary yet authentically Kazakh art form. So there is a performance, sound, improvisation, and poetry. We are used to viewing contemporary art through a European lens, but I'm more interested in parallel, alternative histories to ask new questions about what appears immutable." So I'm arriving now to my conclusion, saying that ITIS has been seen by contemporary artists as a decolonial form of art, free from Western influences, obviously. It allows this symbolic coming back to the origin. What kind of origin is a different question, but they somehow see the coming back to their roots, to the Kazakhness in the context of global crisis, of course, the crisis of war. And then it is simply being integrated into a different, more elitist, probably, art field without, however, amending its content or form. Because in the both examples, you've seen that they were not really changing the artists, they were not performing the artists themselves, they would not propose in a different form, but they would simply use it in a very classical way. Yeah. So I thank you very much for your attention.
So good evening once again. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for Svetlana Gershin for the invitation. It's very interesting evening, I would suggest. And thank you for wonderful first paper. Well done. So anyway, continuing this music issues, developing music issues, but on more theoretical level, in the theoretical frame, because the subject which I've chosen was from vision to institution, cultural leaders, and the shaping of Central Asian music heritage requires some theoretical approach. It's really interesting to look back, because today it's already we already moved to the second quarter of the 21st century, right? And our republics, our Soviet Union has collapsed to 1991, which means a very, very long time ago. So there are plenty of things to look back and to analyze, to make some conclusions, some suggestions, some ideas, and so on. There are many interesting individuals which I brought together on the poster. Thank you very much for producing a beautiful poster, but I sent you many photographs like this, and they're here for a simple reason, to talk about development of Central Asian music and its kind of appearance, its movement from the initial area abroad, to become it famous, and to have some musicians living now here in France or in England, and so on and so forth. It took a long time, and certainly it required some challenges and some development. And that's why some people, I'm going to talk briefly, very briefly, are responsible, let's say, for these challenges and for this development. Oops. I will get back. If you remember from Soviet Union, those who are here from Soviet Union, during the Soviet time, only two groups or organizations related to dance were allowed to go abroad. The Bolshoi Theatre, ballet, right? So because no political issues, nobody is talking, just, dancing. And Bahor ensemble from Uzbekistan, from Tashkent, which was established in 1957. So they had no problem to go anywhere. They were invited all over the globe because they were extremely, extremely popular. So you see that some of them managed later to establish the Academy of Choreography, and it's one of the most famous in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. I, from my visit several years to South Korea, I found there, would you believe, some former students who speak perfect Russian. They learned because they studied in this academy, and still praising, saying, my God, I was the happiest person in the world. I had a chance to study in Tashkent Dance Academy and so on, which means it has really good development and became, world famous, now producing new members of new generation. There are more photographs here, so I wanted to, because it was amazing, and so many interesting research were done, because to establish this ensemble, dance ensemble, the initiators, they studied in the most detailed way Indian dance and all the local neighboring countries dance. And one of the author, by the way, who wrote Uzbek dance monography, the only one so far, is Avdeeva, who is the mother of Natalia Musina. Retrograde again. So, voilà. Donc, before Soviet Union collapsed, in the first years of the independence, Americans and French ethnomusicologists, they were very active, coming, and Ted Levin, for example, studied in the Tashkent State Conservatory. Jan During was visiting it regularly, and so on. Mark Zlobin was writing about, not only about Uzbekistan, he visited it in 1978, something like this. By the way, an American who gave a lecture in Russian, in perfect Russian, about how he connected music of Central Asia with Alaska, saying that people were traveling in the past. That's why so many common features, in the language and the physical appearance and their culture. So that was remarkable, absolutely, his presentation. And Ted Levin wrote books and Jean During wrote books. They produced huge 50, I think, CD compact disc, mostly with Iranian music and so on, but also some Central Asian musicians. This is the new generation, let's say, in terms that they became international number, leaders of the ethnomusicology, local ethnomusicology. Said Alimanov is still a leading, fantastic scholar who published many books and visited all different conferences all over the globe, talking about Kazakh music, Kazakh identity, understanding of Kazakh traditional culture. I remember one of her presentations was "I am Kazakh." It was the title of her presentation in Canada and had a great success. Sasha Jumaev, Alexander Jumaev, also very famous, and he produced a monograph on Maragi al-Maragi, who was the main establisher of the theory of Maqam genre and so on. And Alexander Jumaev is famous as a person who is an archivist, meaning that he learned Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and so on, and he can read all manuscripts from 11th century. But to start with, I wanted to start with photo, please, photo. With Natalia Musina, who is a leading expert in Central Asian traditional literature, culture, and artistic heritage with over 3 decades of personal experience. You can ask me, she's not musician, she's not musicologist. Yes, but going abroad for any exhibitions, she possesses an exceptional practice-based knowledge of regional tradition, artistic lineages, and local cultural ecosystems in Uzbekistan across Central Asia. She has organized, would you believe, more than 340 exhibitions, showcases, music performances, meaning that with musicians she was coming to Paris, to London, and so on, to introduce the culture of Central Asia, and fashion shows, and including France, Germany, the UK, the USA, Austria, Denmark, Poland, Belgium, Russia, Bahrain, Israel, and I am sure it's not the finished line. Her curatorial work is distinguished by its ability to translate local traditions into international cultural contexts while preserving the historical and aesthetic specificity. She has published over 50 articles in France and the United States on the uniqueness of Central Asian artifacts. She is also widely recognized by her sustained support of emerging Uzbek artists. All stars, rising stars, they are working with her because she is really organizing solo exhibitions, facilitating their public and professional recognitions. But the photograph, if you remember from very beginning, I shown to you, this one. It's an interesting photo because everyone who you see on this poster, they all from Central Asia, born and bred and educated. They are all, let's say, the children and the generation who grew up through Soviet Union and later, completely being based on Central Asian culture. That's why we can talk, when I saw the invitation, I thought we should look at our, let's say, followers, at those who are doing everything to bring the knowledge and the experience and practical forums and theoretical, facilities of Central Asian music and culture abroad. So here they are. After Natasha, I wanted, because pictures are first, Professor Desen Kastinov, like we already mentioned, thank you very much, Kazakhstani cultural administration, musician, performer, an educator whose career has been closely associated with the institutional development. I think he's from Karaganday, right? So it's kind of music school, music college, and then Kazakh Almaty Conservatory, which where he became finally director of the conservatory, and then studied in Almaty and Moscow, and later he held senior academic and administrative positions, served as Minister of Culture of the Republic of Kazakhstan. And then for 14 years, he was Secretary General of Turksoy. So that was really something, because for these 14 years, it was essential for the study, for the development of Central Asian music to be introduced all over the world. Because focusing, as you know, headquarters of Turksoy is in Ankara, but closely associated nations and ethnicities from Central Asia, like four Turkic-speaking republics, Turkestan and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. Those artists, the performers, the singers, the dancers, they were closely involved in all international festivals, competitions, and conferences, and so on. He was elected ICTM ambassador now, contributing to international initiative in ethnomusicology. The Professor Kasinov consistently worked across both traditional and classic music domain, because he was also running some competitions for classical music performers, whose performance was included repertoire of Kazakh composers and so on, but it was not traditional instruments, but classical Western instruments. One of the instrumental person for work of Dusan Kasinov, Professor Dusan Kasinov, is Professor Doctor in Art History, member of Union of Composers of Kazakhstan, Saule Utsegaliyeva. It's interesting that Saule managed in 2094 for the first time to run the international conference dedicated to Turkic-speaking world in Almaty. It was 1994, but last year in 2025, she somehow, you know, it was kind of the conclusion, let's say, or you know, feedback to what had happened as the process of development of Turkic-speaking music study in the Turkic-speaking world. So it was very interesting, and immediately published the edited book on musical Turkology today, problems and perspective, and so on. So very active in initiative, in running different events and administration, and also in publications. Now let's look about an interesting phenomenon which I had to face, you know, myself, because many years ago, it was 2005, the ICT World Conference in Sheffield in England, when the group of enthusiasts was gathering together, and they asked me, I didn't know what it's going to be later, it was too late already to get back, you know, to organize this kind of study group on music of the Turkic-speaking people under the label of the ICTM. ICTM is the International Council for Traditional Music. They support all initiative, you know, from the fields, let's say, from various regions, from the various subjects of study of music. And that was our idea, to bring together Turkic-speaking people. When the Soviet Union collapsed and we didn't see each other so often, you know, because the whole music infrastructure, you know, music education and all these festivals, competitions was broken when the Soviet Union was broken. So we really missed each other, because coming from similar countries with similar, you know, way of education and similar music cultures and so on, we wanted to discuss it, to talk about our unity and about our differences. And it became possible thanks to support of the ICTM. And the first one was in 2006. I didn't find the photo to put it here. 2006, it saw us in School of Oriental African Studies, London University, where I was running the first symposium. And then we had, I counted 7 symposium. One of them was in Berlin, another in Cambridge, this one here on this. And then in Astana, Almaty, later 2006, and even in Trabzon. Almaty is the big one. I think it was in the, how do you call it, hall of the first president of Kazakhstan, right, in Almaty. This big hall, you know, huge one, concert hall, no? Or you can't remember, okay. Anyway, it was beautifully, you know, beautiful invitation to take a photo there. We were there for the concert, so we all went to the stage just for the photograph. So, which means regularly meeting, we produced many interesting, we found out how many interesting our comparisons, how much interesting to do this, to compare our genres based on the unity of our languages. And some publications came over. Sacred Knowledge School of Revelation, Master Apprentice Music Training in the Turkic-speaking world, which I edited and was published in Cologne. And then later Turkic Soundscape, edited by myself and Megan Rancière from America, which the Turkish soundscape was approached from shamanic voices to hip hop, which means, you know, all different genres were involved to study, and we found many interesting papers there, so we were very happy to publish it in London. And so as musicology series, we're very happy that it happened in 2018. Now, when we talked about this kind of individuals who are not only born Professor Akate Renkulova, president today of the Turkic Culture and Heritage Foundation with headquarters in Baku, just recently was appointed, I think, 2 years ago. And she is a composer, she is a musicologist, she is a professor and doctor of music, and so on and so forth. And she used to be, by the way, for a few years, the Minister of Culture in Kazakhstan. And suddenly, such a movement, you know, she was invited to become a president of the Turkey Culture and Heritage Foundation, just established in Azerbaijan. It was interesting, and thanks to her, we already ran several conferences in Baku 2 years ago, and then last year, a huge festival and conference in Kyrgyzstan, which means that it was financially possible to have such support and the standing from the you know, Heritage Foundation, Turkish Culture there. And also, they are famous for their publication. The most recent was National Musical Instruments of Turkic-speaking world. There is one figure I wanted to talk about. It's Rosa Amanova in Kyrgyzstan, professor, doctor. She is not only a scholar, which is her recent, let's say, development and achievement. She is fantastic performer. She is from very heart of Kyrgyzstan. She plays komus and sings. She is from the hereditary musician's family, and she learned her skills from her mother. So her mother was performing female epic, you know, cycles, and she learned it from her mother. She became absolutely legendary person in Kyrgyzstan. You can see one of the concerts, you know, she was cheering and with her photographs and so on. She keeps performing, she keeps teaching. She's got female students, ensembles she is leading to teach this old traditional Kyrgyz dastans and songs. And also how it's possible, I don't know, with her energy, she's got fantastic ability to run any international events, kind of doing it, I don't know, in a couple of weeks, whatever. Because the size of it, you know, and high range, you know, of the program and everything, and the whole, you know, process of development is amazing. It's really, when you come to Kyrgyzstan, the last thing you expect to have such a huge celebrations, you know, which last for the concert for 4 hours, you know, non-stop. And she organized 17 international festivals just recently in Kyrgyzstan, can you imagine? And even she managed to find a way to establish and agreed with your government that the Kyrgyz National Day of Kamuz, now celebrated every year in 26 April, you know, so it's a National Day of Music. So these are pictures I wanted to share with you to prove, let's say, in a way, this my initial point that people, individuals, through any possible kind of institutions, manage to, you know, experience, although with problems certainly, however, to approach successful, you know, establishment of the new face, let's say, of Central Asian music from a practical point of view and theoretical point of view. Thanks to this, our music education in Central Asia, once again, I point out that all this music, you know, features you see here, this all belongs to individuals who born and bred in Central Asia. However, now they are internationally famous because behind them is a huge experience of promoting Central Asian music, and they do it with, you know, huge success. So now a bit of theory, okay? If you remember, I'm sure you are all aware that the interest of Western scholars in general, not only ethnomusicologists, in the Muslim republics of the USSR, particularly Central Asia, was especially pronounced during the Cold War. The region was widely regarded as the weakest point of the Soviet Union, owing to the structural tension between Russian communism and Islamic-inflected cultural nationalism. This perspective was articulated in a number of foundational works by Alexander Dennison, Helen Carrier-Denkoz, and Wim Bush, Broxap, etc. And ethnomusicological research closely followed these broader intellectual and political trends, and as an example, as a source of quotation, you can see ICTM study group on music of the Turkic-speaking world from the establishment to the blossom in the huge volume published by ICTM called Celebrating the International Council for Traditional Music, Reflections on the First 7 Decades. Looking back from the present, at the period following the independence of the former Soviet Union, it's evident that the significant changes occurred in the promotion, circulation, and scholarly understanding of Central Asian music. These developments are reflected in both concept, performance practice, and the production of theoretical knowledge. New scholarly figures from Central Asian Republic have emerged as leading voices in the field, among them Saida Yelimanova, Alexandra Jumayev, Soulya Urtigalieva, and so on. In parallel, a number of highly committed cultural specialists played an important mediating role, like Natalia Musina. Gradually, other institutional organizations also began to take an active interest in Central Asia. Particularly significant shift occurred when Professor Dusen Kaseina became Secretary General of Turksoy. The International Cultural Organization of Turkic-speaking people in Ankara presented as part of newly articulated vision of Turkic-speaking heritage for European and North American audiences. Numerous festivals, performances, competition, youth orchestras, and cultural events were initiated and disseminated internationally, including major program held at Nowruz performance at Cambridge University in March 2030. It was stunning. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the entire cultural system that had organized music, art, and authority in Central Asia disappeared, right? I mean, we all remember those difficult years. And the Soviet ideological framework that had shaped cultural production, funding, and legitimacy was suddenly gone. As an example, while visiting Shark Culinary Festival, which runs every second year, by the way, this year will be also, yes, I think it was 2005, Suddenly, the Charter translation is Oriental melody. So you see suddenly a huge group of performers from Moldavia. As far as we remember geography, it never was associated with the Orient and so on. And then we had Latvian choir. Then we had performers from other Latvian Balkan countries. And we understood, it was clearly, felt in the air that we missed this kind of strong association to each other as it used to be during the Soviet Union. Because if there was a festival in Moscow, all 15 republics were represented there. And we used to think it should be like this. But for this Balkan state, Moldova state, they had to send their musicians to Charleroi because it was Samarkand. It was the only way for them to meet, the, let's say, former neighbors and so on. But however, to show their performance and sometimes to get some, to win some competition, so to get some money. That was really kind of felt, that the missing point, because before it was all together, now it was completely different. So it was kind of a vacuum. Newly independent states had to rebuild system of meaning, value, and cultural governance from scratch. In this situation, culture, and especially musical heritage, became a key source for state building. Music was not any longer only an artistic or social practice. It was expected to provide legitimacy, continuity with the past, institutional authority, access to funding, and international recognition. As a result, heritage institution and heritage discourse didn't emerge simply to protect tradition, but to serve strategic, political, and diplomatic purposes. So, through the regular participation in international musical conferences and frequent encounters with colleagues from across the former Soviet Union, that was possible to organize that study group with the ICTM, and we were very happy. Because during the Soviet Union, that was not possible to feel our unity, because the whole cultural system and the ideological rules was based on divide and conquer. And that's why it's only after Soviet Union collapsed, I remember on one of the television, program about meeting of presidents, let's say Turkmen president and Azerbaijani and so on. Suddenly they start to talk each other without translators, and we were struck how it's possible, but it was allowed, and they understood, the unity through language, that it was allowed to talk on the similar languages from the same group of the Turkic-speaking people. In post-Soviet Union, musical heritage, therefore, became institutionalized, not mainly through preservation, but through translation. Tradition had to be translated from the local practice into state policy, from embodied memory into written documentation, and from charismatic authority of some individual into bureaucratic system. Through this process, music became something that could be garnered, funded, classified, and represented internationally. Central Asian states entered the global heritage economy. Musical heritage also became a tool of cultural diplomacy through UNESCO programs on intangible cultural heritage, which brought up the huge amount of traditional genres in every single Central Asian republic, which became, intangible cultural heritage and supported by UNESCO. So that was amazing to find, I don't know whether it was 8 different genres for Uzbekistan, suddenly out of the blue. I mean, UNESCO exists for so many years, and suddenly, let's say in 2009 or 10, suddenly 8 genres came over. But they are 1,000 years old, these genres, which means during the Soviet Union, neither this kind of association with UNESCO and coverage and help in the association financially was not possible even to imagine. For this reason, music heritage in the post-Soviet context is institutionalized primarily through translation rather than preservation. Therefore, should not be simply institutionalization, simply understand it as cultural development or progress. It's a continuous process of negotiation between state ideology and cultural autonomy, between global recognition and local meaning. Leadership within this system operates less through personal charisma and more through structural mediation between state power, cultural authority, and global heritage regime. Together, heritage production, institutional authority, and mediated leadership form an integral system through which culture becomes central to post-Soviet state formation, identity construction, and symbolic sovereignty. To conclude with, at independence, institutionalization is essential because sovereignty cannot survive as memory, charisma, or resistance alone. It must be embedded in durable structures that transform liberation into governance, identity into legitimacy, and culture into authority. In post-Soviet Central Asia, institutionalization became essential as independence became, because the collapse of Soviet culture infrastructure produced a profound vacuum of legitimacy, authority, and meaning. New states were completed to reconstruct governance not only through political institutions, but through cultural ones, transforming heritage into a substitute ideological system. Musical traditions were institutionalized not simply to preserve them, but to translate embodied memory into bureaucratic legitimacy, local authority into national symbolism, and cultural practice into international visibility. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Razia, for this very interesting presentation. Do you have some question, maybe here or maybe in Zoom? Yeah, Sylvia.
Thank you very much for these very interesting presentations. I have one question. Let's say, I must say that I don't know anything about the topic you've just addressed. So sorry, my questions are very naive. A question to both of you, perhaps, and then to each of you. The first one is there perhaps any? You spoke about the relation between these musical genres and national building, and I was wondering if in the after the collapse of the Soviet Union, whether there were attempts to build, let's say, national genres that will be distinct from the musical genres of the neighboring republic, and if this could impact the music itself. If there was this musical engineering for, let's say, one, how do you call it? To be distinct, to be, for example, for a public to recognize the Kazakh from an Uzbek, the creation of national musical genres. That's my first question. My second question would be for the first presentation. You spoke about the participation of these musicians in the event in January 86. I was wondering what happened after that, whether it was something that I was not sure to understand your point about it. When there is a protest, you mentioned including recently, but I would like to know a bit more about that. Sure. And regarding your very interesting also presentation, I was wondering about the public. You spoke about the circulation. That's a question to Razia Sultanova. You spoke about the actors, the institutional actors, and I would like to know who is the public of this, if it is possible to understand at the local level, not on the international one, who is attending the concert, are the old generation, the young generation,
Concept of traditional music within countries.
Yes, and I was also, or everybody, I mean, just, and also I was wondering, and perhaps because of your first presentation about the circulation, I mean, I have the feeling, but I may be wrong, that you have this traditional music, then it goes into the international networks, and it comes back after this international circulation, and does it change the public locally at the local level? For example, for the younger generation, for the hipsters, let's say, after being after a tour in Western country, for example, or But so that's a thing, and also a question about the link. If I'm sure there should be for some with religion. Is there a link with this? Is the short chance with religion? Sorry if this too much and perhaps.
I think it's maybe better if you start from Sorbonne and after we can see if you have some.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll try to respond. Thank you very much for your questions. So how to distinguish each country,
if there were attempt to.
So there was not attempt to like music engineering.
Yeah,
basically the
nationalizing.
No. So the nationalizing comes exactly through UNESCO. This is my point,
Okay.
because now UNESCO brands it as being Kyrgyz or being Kazakh. Although previously it was just a common heritage, and it still is common heritage, as Turksoy suggests. But in the UNESCO, you can see only mention of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and this is very interesting because I know there is this attempt to make it as a national heritage also for other things, like celebration of Nowruz, for example. I know that there were attempts to make it as a cultural heritage of Kyrgyzstan, and now I mean it's a bit funny because it actually belongs to everyone, celebrated by everyone, but UNESCO acknowledges it as one country's heritage. But maybe how you can distinguish it when you hear it, the performance, is just only through language that you can see. I mean, the form would be the same, but in Kyrgyzstan they would think in Kyrgyz, in Uzbekistan in Uzbek, in Kazakhstan in Kazakh, and this is still the case. But yeah, regarding the,
shall I also add to the first question? It's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. First of all, I think it's quite common in other neighboring cultures. In Uzbek, it's called differently, let's say Gap-il or Askiya and so on. But it's the same kind of competition. Who is playing better, who is teasing better, who is responding better. So it's really a very big issue, very popular genre, which present not only on the stage, but in weddings, in all kinds of celebration. And regarding UNESCO, very good example about Nowruz. I remember the first time UNESCO tried to bring it as an intangible cultural heritage, intangible, but they brought together with Middle East and Central Asia. It failed because it's, however, can you imagine in Iran or in Kyrgyzstan? Absolutely. Oh yes, I was involved as an evaluator, by the way, and only later. That's why I know that it kind of 20 years ago they tried, but it failed with the project. And then when separately they started separately, it worked out. Yes. So let's say, please.
So the point about the 1986 events and the ITIS that I was trying to make is that the essence of ITIS is you have to be openly critical and say truth about societal issues. This is the basis. Without it, it's not ITIS. But when you have 1986 event and you live in the Soviet Union, you cannot say people were killed and they were like innocent. You cannot say so openly. So they were suppressed. They were actually not allowed to hold ITIS anymore, because the idea is that they would want to criticize it. Everyone was talking about it, but people could not address it publicly, you see? So that was like an attempt to kind of stop it. And that's why they stopped all of the concerts that took place at this big, beautiful hall.
But there were no concerts in the street, for example.
There were, but in the region, not in the capital. So it still existed, of course. Everyone was talking about it, but there was like no public stage for it. So in the public sphere, it stopped existing. That was the point.
And regarding traditional, if it's the same question, you said youngster musician. You wouldn't believe the other way around. The more traditional musicians go abroad, the more they're inspired when they're coming back, because they understood that their music has not only local value, but human value, all kinds of world, value, and it helps them to become better and better performers. And they say they share it with their colleagues, their friends, their course mates and so on, course mates, and as a result, it only helps to enhance, the skillful performance. And for example, you asked about the young performers, this Turan ensemble, because the performers, they play very good, certainly guitar and all this Western music, but they brought together, they made a fusion, let's say, of the contemporary upbeat music, with traditional Kazakh rhythms, and voice, ornamentations. And as a result, it produced, wonderful CDs. They recorded, right? Several CDs, and they're the only one, still to be the only one who goes this way, although there are some followers. So in a way, it helps, bring all genres together. And for youngsters in particular, it's one of the very good impulse for them to, go further.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is for the first speaker. You mentioned that the competition can take place between a man and a woman. The question is, does genre have any potential for gender equality? And in general, what is the gender identity of the genre? Thank you very much, Anna. I don't know your last name for this question, but it's actually very gender exclusive type of art, because women were always part of this. There is like a record of some artists taking place in the 19th century where women were participating, and they would always respond from their feminine position. For example, there is a record of one artist where a man would say he would know that a woman would be pregnant and that she would bear a child outside of the marriage, and he would kind of try to shame her for that, and she would reply openly that, well, she's happy to bring a healthy child to this life. So basically, with her art, she kind of stopped all of the criticism and was actually accepted. So women were always part of it, and nowadays younger Afghans, of course, they address quite clearly the feminist issues, of which we have many today, but they can address it. So it's very gender inclusive.
Just to add a little bit about Kazakh music. Kazakh traditional performers history has a very interesting individual called Dina Nurpeisova, the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. She was like a goddess, for people. It was a real legendary, famous woman with fantastic voice, fantastic ability to improvise and so on. Also, she was remarkable for spotting very talented children and let's say blessing them, Sarajevo, one of them, so which means it's a very interesting gender issue that in Kazakhstan that was always equal, so there was no problems with public performance.
Then I have another question then for two people.
Can you read it?
Yeah, I will read it. Thank you so much for the presentations. The question for both scholars is whether there is a tension between sacred and profane ritual settings and locally embedded oral traditions. That is also related to the question of authenticity, like Manas and epic storytelling brought not to festivals, while they were only allowed to occur in sacred spiritual settings.
You can talk about Manas.
Yeah, so I'm not previous. I'm not going to talk about Manas. I'm not going to gatekeep Manas, but for artists, what I was trying to say, Manas is a different type of oral art. So basically, the idea with Turkic people is that quite often all of these types of art would be oral, but artist is a different one, and it's really not about sacred settings and ritual settings. Although there were artists that were called Zhoktao artists that were performed on the occasion of someone's death. This could happen. And there were actually the intersections of different But I don't think Manas could be addressed the same way because Manas is really like serious recitation.
It's a very long
Yeah.
cycle
Yeah.
of points, you know, and by its sacred meaning, it's considered to be like a Bible. let's
Yeah,
say
right.
that. So Kyrgyz, they can quote, you know, lines from Manas like proverbs, and they found in Manas everyone can find proverb for every human situation and human life. So Manas is really sacred.
Yeah.
And the same sacred, there is an interesting, the whole, you know, underground development in female rituals and female performance, and particularly in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, Halpa, and in Uzbekistan, Otinoy. Those women, they're like female imams. They are living in particular in rural area, and they're the main authorities in villages because any family having a newborn child or marriage preparation, or someone passed away, or even, you know, someone got a very good job. So they invited these ladies, you know, and they should go into ritual with praying and some hymns, you know, some stories from the history of Islamic, you know, Islamic heroes and so on, saints and so on. So it's a real underground because, as you know, during the Soviet Union, religions were banned. And if these women wouldn't do it only for female performance, performing only for female members of their community, they wouldn't survive. And they perform, it's a large repertoire. You wouldn't believe sometimes they perform poems from 11th century.
How do you mention the name of these female imams?
Otinoy in Uzbekistan and Halpa in Turkmenistan. In Kazakhstan, they all different.
Another question?
Yes, it's not a question, it's just a remark. So I think in Uzbekistan, you have also to mention the Tajik music, which is very important, and also the Jewish, the importance of Jewish community, with a very important role, like Khan and so on.
In Bukhara.
In Bukhara, and don't forget that Samarkand and Bukhara are, you know, majority of, you know, Tajik population. So now we hear, you know, I've been there for 40 years in Uzbekistan, and I see now there is a kind of national vision, Turkey, so on. But, you know, we must not forget this also very important part of Tajik and Jewish communities in music, especially in music.
Yes, yes. But people in Bukhara and Samarkand in general don't consider themselves Tajik. They consider themselves double speaking, double language, you know.
They are double. I'm not talking about the language. They are all bilingual, of course.
Absolutely,
But,
yeah.
But they feel Tajik. So it's important for them. And I have many friends which, you know, they seem closer to Iranian world.
Yes, but
Turkic ones.
in the past, all classical poetry was written in both languages, you know, Persian and Chagatai, which is
Chagatai,
which means this
yes.
duolingual, bilingual, you know, process went from Middle East, you know, to the present time. And certainly Bukharian Jewish musicians, they were very good, but most of them, they left.
They
returned to Israel, to America, and so on. So now it's less and less, unfortunately. Yes, yes. That's true. Multinational, we are from multinational world. Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question. Speaking of who values this heritage, yeah. If it has this subversial potential, as you speak, is it valued by the authorities, or what do they do with it? Do they transform it somehow to lower its subversial potential? And a part of the contemporary art, is it promoted by some other actors? And if it does to what for?
Yeah, a very important question. Thank you. So yeah, it's been basically the idea is that there are so many elements, so it's being instrumentalized by every actor. So it's being interpreted in one way by contemporary artists, it's being interpreted in another way by the state. And of course, the state, when they love artists, they would use it all the time, but they would always kind of, push away the political content, the political element. They would try to control it. There were attempts during Nazarbayev's rule where he would try to censor them. He also, at some point, provided money from his own political party to support them. And this was an attempt to buy, right, of course. And there were some also cases when he would ask them not to talk about this subject, or au contraire, on the contrary, to sing about Astana, for example, the new capital. So there was a moment when he built it, he was like, yeah, you should maybe promote this idea. So basically everyone kind of sees their own interest in this type of art. And of course, there are many different positionalities, I think. So are those of artists whose interest is primarily economic. So they would only see it as a way of gaining money. And of course, then they would do anything just to get this money. And there's some others who say, no, I am a mediator, I'm a voice of people, I'm here to speak only truth. And they have a different perspective. So there's like no unique position, I would say, kind of multi-actor, multi-interpretive way, yeah.
Yes, please.
I was also a little question to Dilda. How movies or performers see the old Soviet ones? Mm-hmm. I think that jungle is not very wild now, no. But Dina Lupisova is. Yeah. And what are all the other figures,
Yeah, so there are very many of them who are still celebrated, who were popular during Soviet times and who are celebrated. Of course, they would not maybe be the ones who would voice the socialist agenda. So, there are still a lot of items that were taking place in the regions. And so each region would have their own representative. So today, it's surprising because there is a division in how they interpret it. In general, they see that it was a way of political submission and everything. But on the other hand, they say that, for example, in one of the interviews, they would say that actually Communist Party would provide infrastructure and it was free for them. Because now in the capitalist reality of independent Kazakhstan, they have to kind of crowdfund, they have to look for money. But previously, Soviet Party could also help them. So there is a binary relation to that. I would say that it's only Jean-Paul who is being seen very critically and maybe less in Kazakhstan itself. Outside of Kazakhstan, I see more of that, but inside, not so much. But we'll see what's going to change. But others are still respected, and they are respected precisely because they could, keep this type of art even through harsh Soviet times, like transmitters of this knowledge.
I can a short question to Dilda. Kazakhstan is very big, and have you seen any specific of edition, different Russian edition in Kazakh region, first of all, in northern part of Kazakhstan?
No, I wouldn't say that there are regional specificities in ITIS itself. There would be maybe, because the idea now that previously in the 19th century, for example, they could last 10 hours because it would not be non-stop. Nowadays, of course, they're much shorter. And nowadays they have 4 rounds. So in the first round, they would present themselves, who they are. And the second round, they would need to say something about the territory. Mm-hmm. So what would be different is that they would highlight their own region or the region where they take place, and they would try to know the kind of the genealogy of this specific region. But in terms of how it's being performed, there's not a big difference even with Kyrgyzstan, honestly. Yeah.
Maybe just about the Agahan Foundation. Maybe how would like to mention this question of Ismaili music in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. How Agahan changed also the rigors of international production about this music, because they are really supported, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, not in other countries. Pakistan also, of course, Afghanistan, they developed maybe just some thoughts about this.
It's difficult to talk about Agahan. It's better if you invite someone like Ted Levin, you know, because he's involved, and yes, and because even if you go to the Agahan institution in Bishkek, they don't have anything online, not online, on the website about the music curriculum and so on, nothing. So it's all kind of goes, you know, there. That's why it's better to have someone who represents the institution.
What they're doing really, what is support for our music, our countries, what is the relationships between the peoples.
It's better to ask them.
Also.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because we have traditional music with traditional artists and the states who organizing this promotion to pay some money to organize some spectacles in UNESCO, I don't know where. And for contemporary artists, who organizes promotion, or nobody know nothing about this new generation who speak about politics or other things.
So there's like no organization, like specific organization, but Tselimi would be one of the centers which would stage this kind of exhibition, or even this Siludek, the ones that I showed you, was taking place at the Italian Cultural Center. So we see like other countries' cultural organizations are also kind of here, and they want to contribute, but I don't think there's like one organization that organizes it still. Maybe it will emerge in the future. Not yet. Maybe, yeah, maybe not yet. I don't know. But I also don't. I mean, I have a lot of criticism towards how contemporary artists approach it, honestly. But maybe it's a different topic, and it will, demand more time.
3 years ago, I was invited to give a pre-concert talk at the Edinburgh Festival in the UK. Because the Kazakh group of contemporary music from Astana, they came to perform. And so because nobody knows what is Kazakhstan, where it's situated and so on, so I had to give some kind of general geography history presentation. But it means that they found sponsors, that there are some who sponsor contemporary musicians, you know, and certainly they're lovely musicians. In Kazakhstan now, there are 2 conservatories, let's say. One is in Astana, another one in Almaty, the old one. And that's why this also produces a competition which helps, you know, to improve in all kinds of performances and publications and everything. So Kazakhstan is the right place for that. And as usual, these contemporary musicians, they know where to apply and how to find, you know, the right person who understands the music and the, you know,